Okay. Well, tomorrow, if you're listening to this when our episode comes out, we will be wishing our loved ones, akemashite omedetou gozaimasu.
明けましておめでとうございます。Yes!
Yay! Or a Happy New Year in Japanese. And if you're a longtime listener, you know that DEI work or whatever we're going to be calling it going forward is very personal to us. We're both the daughters of one Japanese immigrant parent and one white American parent each. So the ideas of multiculturalism and difference and identity are embedded in our DNA. And we were raised to have respect not only for our own diverse histories, but those of all others in the world. After all, we're each only one of 8 billion people in this world. And you bet that everyone has their own story, their own way of living, thinking, and being in our society.
Thank you for establishing that because on top of that, I actually want to be clear about our chosen families, Misasha. So you, Misasha, are married to a black man and Misasha has two very multi-ethnic sons who are black, Japanese, and white. And we on the podcast have spent years laying the groundwork to help you understand anti-black racism, right? And do other things like deconstruct the model minority myth. And let's be clear. We do this work because if even one person listening has an aha moment and changes their actions or talks to someone about something they learned here, which changes their actions so that Misasha's boys can come home safe at night, or so you make decisions that might potentially improve or even save the lives of children who look like them, then we will have been successful. On top of that, so I'm Sara. I'm married to a white Canadian man. I have two teenage girls that the world presumes to be white. So going back to this idea of all of this work continuing to be personal, doing the work to challenge our own assumptions about other people, that matters to us too, because not everybody is what they seem. And with a Canadian husband, standing against anti-immigration sentiment matters to us, not to mention for both of our Japanese immigrant parents. And then understanding the link between the systems of oppression that hurt not only Black people, but neurodivergent people, females, and so many others is really critically important to us here on this show.
So, to date, we have hosted 262 episodes of the Dear White Women podcast because helping people listen, learn, and act differently to help uproot systemic racism is really what we need to make the world truly more equitable for all of us. And, this is the foundation. The work starts here. And perhaps most importantly, we can't do it without your help. You'll hear in this episode what we will be up to in 2025 with a little detour into a few reflections on 2024. And in brief, for 2025, we've got this for you. We're going to be speaking to organizations, including schools, companies, ERGs, and more, about two topics in particular that we think are critically important at this point in history. So the first one is why equity and inclusion matters now more than ever, or in other words, what is the psychology of belonging? And the second one, how to have difficult conversations.
So if you have groups that you think would benefit or know people who could hire us at their organizations, please connect us. You can reach us at the email address hello@dearwhitewomen.com anytime. Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We're your hosts, Sara and Misasha.
All right, so we sort of laid it out there in our opening, but before we go back and go more in depth about 2025 and our plans going forward in true New Year's style fashion, and in particular, sort of the cleaning of the old, how about a minute for 2024 or what we choose to remember from it? Because maybe we don't want to remember all of it, and maybe that's just me speaking right now. But Sara, I want to start by asking you, what was something memorable from our work together in 2024?
Yes, it's a great question. And I had a brilliant thought about this earlier in the day. And of course, now I can't remember it. But I would say a couple things. One is, you and I behind the scenes regularly share our opinions about so many things, from my terrible fashion sense all the way to greater politics in the United States and beyond. I would say, though, that being so clear politically about our views on Trump was incredibly powerful. I haven't used my voice or taken an outward stand on politics outside like my inner circle at the kitchen table or in my friend groups quite that loudly before. And to have created a platform between the two of us that we could then use to share our well thought out fact-based, opinions and concerns was incredibly memorable. I thought that was something that I will take with me for a long time in terms of using our voice and feeling more comfortable putting a mic in front of it. And I think also two other things. Life really lifed hard for me this year on a personal note. It was a hard year. And to have basically across the board, all of the organizations that I've done work with, I worked with a group called Extraordinary Women on Boards. And I know it will tie back into our work together, but having unbelievably high caliber women support me, adjust with me, and be willing to create a workplace that would meet the needs I had so that I could show up for my family the way I needed to was really powerful. And by extension, also like that happened in our work together. As best friends, you knew everything that was going on. You moved mountains to make my life possible and for us to continue doing the work that we did. So luckily in our case, working with best friends is like the most unbelievably cool experience ever. And, I've had a great 5 years working with you so far. Never has that felt even more important than it did for me personally this year. So I really, really appreciate you for that. And then the last bit is where we're at with the crux of the work, right? I love well-being. I love understanding what makes humans tick. And so for a long time, it was like, how do you do social justice work and then talk about positive psychology? What is the overlap? I don't see it, said other people. Like, I always knew there was something here because if you believe that, for example, a workplace needs well-being, well, then you need to have well-being for all. All of your people need to feel seen, feel like they are being cared for, and more. So seeing this overlap and having personally the experience of workplace cultures that have supported my needs during a really difficult time made me feel very deeply convinced that this is an important part of the work we need to bring forward to organizations and that workplace well-being for everybody deeply matters. And so I think all of these things are very memorable for me in terms of what I'll take from it and how it propels me going forward. How about you?
Okay, so I love your answer, first of all. I always hate following you when you do these very
Stop
deep
it. You are like the most
introspective
articulate
answers.
human who is so thoughtful ever. Okay, go. Go, go,
I'm
go.
just
I'll
throwing
start.
that out there. Okay, so, I will say, and we've talked about this on the podcast, what are we going to say to our grandchildren, right? When they say, what did you do in this time period? Because 2020, I'm laughing because I feel like we said this about 2016, we said this about 2020. This is one of those things, those year periods, right, where they're going to write about this and going forward, right? Obviously, everything that's led up to this point. And I think it's going to be one of those moments where your grandkids look at you, or, even our own children right now, right, can look at us and say, like, well, what are you doing, right? What did you do? And I personally feel really proud to say, like, I think we did exactly what we were supposed to do this year, to sit like in integrity with who we are, and using our platform in ways both funny and very serious to talk about the real dangers that we see. I'm not going to put that in past tense because I'm going to say saw, and then that's not accurate. That we see in a Trump presidency, right, is something I'm most proud of, I think. Similarly to you, I think using our voice in this way, and when I think about it, like using our voice in this way, when I was using my legal skills for election protection work, and now going forward, trying to see how I can work with organizations that are trying to preemptively combat what they see coming down the pike, right? Which is the opposite of the anticipatory obedience that we've been seeing, to date. I think that's what we can do, right? And I think that's something that we have this platform for in a lot of ways, because this is the systemic oppression that we talk about, right? Sort of come to life writ large. So I think in a nutshell, like that is really something memorable that I will take with us. Because I think that was the constant, normally in our podcast seasons, we have sort of seasons where we're like, okay, we're going to talk about this and we're going to talk about that. I feel like this whole year was a year where we were talking about like, this is why this election is so important. And like, how can we think about these issues and how can we talk to each other about these issues? And I know our work is on that front is really starting, right? Because we're looking at the next 4 years. But I am so proud of us for getting to this point, and being as loud as we were about that.
Virtual high five. Woo! I like hearing that we're sort of preparing because there is a lot more to come and a lot more work to be done. And hopefully everyone listening will also understand that and participate in this work and this journey. But what surprised you most about this past year then?
So I think this answer is actually going to surprise you because between the two of us, I feel like I'm the one where you're like, we should do this. And then the lawyer in me is like, you know what? Like, have we thought about these four ramifications? And I know you love that answer because it's like exactly what you want to hear all the time.
It's actually an excellent part of our partnership. I'm regularly the person who's throwing spaghetti at a wall, being like, will it stick? Will this stick? Will this stick? Like I'm like a child, and you're regularly pulling the pieces off, being like, no, Sarah, no, honey, not now.
So I want you to hear this next part. I actually feel a lot of optimism going into 2025. I couldn't even write this in the notes because I wanted this to be like a genuine thing. Okay, so this is why, right? I keep thinking about Jeffrey Robinson, right? And the film Who We Are, right? Which we talked about on the podcast back in 2021 or whenever it came out. And I think about that line a lot where he talks about history, right? And history is not linear. You move 3 steps forward, you move 2 steps back. And I feel like we are definitely in that 2 steps back phase right now, right? I don't think anyone's going to argue with me.
Really?
I don't think anyone's arguing with me about that. But the thing that I think is now we are going to head into that 3 steps forward because we have seen there's a lot of change happening, right? I'm not talking about just in the US. In this past month alone, like let alone, probably the past week, there's been so many changes on a global front too, that I think now there is the space to build and change, right? And you have a group of people that despite the election outcomes, which is not part of my optimism, right? I sense a difference, right, in how people are reacting. Because I don't think it's going to be, and we can talk a little bit more about this for the 2025 part, but I don't think it's going to be giant movements, right? I think it's going to be local and focused on community, how we resist. And that part, like, I did not anticipate ending 2024 feeling hope about the possibilities, right? Like I was more expecting to be in a doom spiral, but I'm not. And so that is actually very surprising to me, but it gives me a lot of hope because it helps me reframe how we move into 2025 and inauguration day and everything that follows, right? As the possibility as opposed and thinking about resistance at a local level, as opposed to I'm now going to sit on my couch in a doom scroll and feel so stuck, right? So that is personally surprising to me. How about you?
First, I appreciate what you shared, just to react to that, because I think so much of whether it's anti-racism work, political work, whatever, we have a tendency in this country to think big. And like, if I don't create the next women's march, I'm no good. I'm not going to do anything. If I can't affect the presidential election, then I've done nothing. And so what's the point? And so to refocus our lens on our local communities and make a difference in that way and fortify the actual people who interact on a day-to-day basis with all of us in our lives and make a difference there actually does bring me hope too. I kind of like that reframe and the difference in focus. I think, I don't know if it's similar, it's not, but what surprised me about 2024 was I felt like for the first time since George Floyd's murder, I saw more white women being impacted by things greater than themselves. I saw so many white women literally brought to tears talking about the election, talking about the devastation, feeling it like on a personal level, something that was happening on a big scale. And so I think, it depends. There was a huge uptick and then backslide, but like you said, there's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Maybe this is yet again another connection point for people to understand that we are part of a great big community, whether it's our community, to our states, to our nation. people tapped into it emotionally. And so if we can harness that emotional connection to continue to move forward, I think there is possibility. And so that was what surprised me. I didn't necessarily expect to see that kind of response and desire to participate for a few years. And so I think maybe if they can also motivate and focus on the community, I mean, I think there's possibility here.
I love that. I hope, right, that we can continue to focus on that world that's bigger than ourselves, right? Because I think hopefully that's one of the big learnings that didn't necessarily come out of COVID, right? But maybe will come out of this election in a more impactful way, especially to your point, is to see how many white women personally felt impacted as opposed to a distance from like, oh, this is impacting someone else and I should probably care about this. I think it's a different feeling and hopefully we can really harness that energy. So I'm with you on that. So let's talk about then where do we go from here in 2025?
I had said I wanted to talk about this. And so I'm glad I'm going to be able to throw this word out there because I don't think we can let this year go by without sharing the Economist's word of the year: kakistocracy, the rule of the worst. I loved the word when I heard it, but then I immediately wanted to go into question asking mode, which is like, what is the rule of the worst? What do I think is the worst? And I asked that, because sometimes we make grand statements about things without really thinking them through. And so for me, I would argue the worst is a leader who uses abusive language, who's been convicted of multiple wrongdoings, not just one mistake, who seems to believe that implementing policies that only benefit a select few instead of the masses is the right thing to do, or maybe who doesn't believe in science and history and actual fact. Those sorts of things might be the worst to me, because I think on the flip side of that, some of the best leaders are the ones who infuse their culture with humanity or with an understanding for our need to feel like we all belong, who doesn't want to exploit their workers, who understands that science and history and policy implications are bigger than themselves so they can base their decisions on sound fact and have good outcomes on a sustainable basis. So with those two standing in contrast to one another in terms of leadership, I would say it sounds like the kakistocracy will be taking power as the highest leader in our land again. And so we cannot be complacent in 2025.
I think it's a good word. When I think about that word too, I think about it on a national level, right? But I also think about it locally as well, because I think there are a lot of ways in which complacency lets I didn't practice saying the word, everyone, as you so what Sara said. I see it in small ways too, right? I see it in kids' sports teams. I see it in school boards. I see it in local government. And I think that these are the ways that we can resist at a national level, sure, but we can resist at a local level as well, right? Who are the people that we have in charge of things like our children, of things like our local government, of things like our, who makes decisions about what stores are put in our communities, where we shop, where we have our transportation options, our, just little things that directly impact us, where we may not feel the federal or national, policy impact in the same way. I think that even if you think about it, and it's kind of like thinking about the end of the universe, right? And it is such a massive undertaking if you think about it on a national level. But if you think about it in your daily lives, I think that's where we can also look at how we resist, how we fight complacency.
To take that one step further, I wonder how many times we ask ourselves if we're contributing to being the worst. Because I think that's the easiest blind spot, but it's like the fastest path to hypocrisy, which makes change never happen. And I mean, even if I think about how I parent sometimes, if I were to ever stop and define like what makes the worst parent, holy crap, have I ever done some of those things? Abso-freaking-lutely. And do I need to check myself before I start pointing fingers at other people? Absolutely. So I wonder if asking those questions, what would the rule of the worst look like? And how do I make sure I'm not showing up with that kind of energy on a regular basis so that I can lead with integrity, so that I can set the tone and stand firm, knowing that, my expectations for whether it's your local government, your school board, your whatever are XYZ. I hold myself in integrity and show up that way, I'm not being hypocritical, demanding that and demanding better of the people in my community is probably also pretty important.
I think that you've hit on something that is so hard for people, right? That internal work, that internal reflection, right? It's really easy to externalize, oh, I will donate $25 to support something. But to do that reflection is hard, but that's where the change starts. And so I'm glad you brought that up because that's a really important point.
Because relevant to our work in terms of where we are with DEI, like you said, whatever we wind up calling it, there was a write-up from the folks at the Just Report, which is a great organization that ranks the most just companies and looks at that greater thing of what do we do to not be ruled by the worst. And they say this, and I quote, "The first is that framing and terminology are critically important. Language such as treating all employees fairly, providing equal access to opportunity, and equal pay for equal work is something almost everyone seems to get behind. The second is replacing politics and ideology with disciplined business case thinking. Companies that evolve DEI work, however they frame it, to focus on issues that improve workplace culture and financial performance will create much more value from their investment." End quote. And so I think the point of that is at the end of the day, no matter what you call it, DEI is about deconstructing systems that are created to treat people like cogs in a machine. And instead, remember that we're all human beings. And I mean, if you're a human being in this world, which you obviously are, you know that you're not an infinitely usable resource, right? We all have needs, wants, emotions. We can either be made to thrive or be spat out to dry. And so if we head in that latter direction, I feel like our country is going to break. So the only sustainable way forward is to do whatever we need, whether it's tweaking the language or whatever, in order to make it palatable to those who only think as far as the superficial words. But the point is to stay with these deep shifts and changes that need to be made to impact culture, whether it's in our companies, our schools, our communities, and of course, in our homes.
I think that's important because, to echo what you said, the words may change. And when I think about diversity, for example, I heard someone say recently that it is and is, right? It is something that it exists, right? It exists in every space, regardless of whether you've chosen it or not. So how do we think about our path on that, right? Including equity and inclusion and belonging and thinking about how we show up for ourselves and each other. Because, the words have changed and even whole movement titles have changed over the years, right? What we have called this fight. But the work itself remains the same. And even if, we take 3 steps forward and then 2 steps back, it's important to remember that we are collectively moving on that path forward, right? So the way I see it, I think the way we both see it is we've got no choice but to fight for all of us in 2025. So we hope you all are ready to do the work and stay tuned for more ways to do that from us in the new year, because it comes down to, again, all of us or none of us. And even when it looks like the latter, we will still be convinced of the former.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sara and Misasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.